So just like in past meetups, we're going to focus with our expert, and Livia Raulinaitis is with us today. So I'm excited to introduce her in just a second. But I'm excited that Livia is here. So we first met several years ago when Livia was down at the Dawes Arboretum as a resident, and then she moved on into a position with Dawes in the conservation area, and has just recently taken a position with the Xerces Society in Maine, which is really exciting. So she's been moving and getting her feet wet with that new position, but agreed to come and talk about this wonderful PDF document that she and Melissa Spring put together on the specialist bees of Ohio. And so, Livia, thanks so much for coming in this morning and talking with us about specialist bees and what we can plant. Glad to have you here.
All right. Well, I'm so excited to have a chance to talk to you all a little bit about specialist bees. As Denise mentioned, I'm just moving into a new role up in Maine that started as of yesterday. But you know, for the past many, many years, I've been in Central Ohio, and I had the awesome chance to collaborate with the Ohio State University, Melissa Spring, in collaborating parts of the Ohio Bee Survey, which many of you may already be familiar with. Many of you may have actually participated in this effort. But for those of you that aren't familiar with the Bee Survey, it's essentially a first of its kind survey of all bee species in Ohio. So prior to 2020, nothing like this had ever been done in the state before. And so the first year of the study, we were looking at, in general, the bee species of Ohio across various landscapes. And it was in the second year of the study that we kind of switched gears to looking at specialist bees, because those can be a little bit harder to isolate, I guess, within landscapes. And so as part of the preparation work for that year's surveys, for this past year's surveys, we had a chance to do a bit of a deep dive into the specific species of specialists within Ohio, and to really take a look at the floral hosts that depend on them, you know, those floral hosts distributions. And I'm really excited to have a chance to share some of that information with you, because it's really valuable, not just from a survey standpoint, but also from a standpoint of being able to, you know, install these plants on the landscape, because we all have a sphere of influence, right? And so whether you're working in a small home landscape, or if you're working on large restorations, you know, you can put these plants into a landscape at any scale and know that you are benefiting the very species that depend on them. So many of you are probably very, very knowledgeable about native bees, and anybody who saw Brian Danforth's webinar last week is probably more knowledgeable than I am about the specific specialist bees in our area. But it's important for us to set the stage about why we're talking about plants within the context of this relationship. So I'll admit that I am first and foremost a plant person. I have more botanical training than I do bee training. And so I just love learning about the interrelationships between plants and their native pollinators. So many of you know that many of our charismatic bee species, so I'm thinking about our common eastern bumblebee, for example, you know, those are generalist bees. They will forage on pretty much anything that they can get their hands on. But, you know, there are lots of species of bees that require very specific plants to complete their life cycles. And of course, those are our specialists, right? And so that's a mutualistic relationship. The bees receive the pollen that they need to provision their offspring. And in return, the flower gets the pollination service that facilitates its reproduction, essentially. So it stands to reason that if you want to find specialist bees, you're going to need the plants that they depend on them within the landscape. So we're going to talk about a number of different plants today. I have about 20 minutes, so I don't have much of an opportunity to tell you about all of the specialist floral hosts that we have in our state. But my goal is to tell you about a couple of my favorites, a couple of families that you can look for, and then also to talk a little bit about this guide to specialist bees. So really quickly, before I jump into this document that you see here, I'm going to switch gears. I have just a couple of slides. It's not really a slideshow, but a couple of primer slides to kind of illustrate some of the foundations I think that are really important when we're talking about plants. So I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment so I can switch gears. bear with me here for just a moment.
Livia, how much snow did you get up there?
Oh my gosh, we got nearly 2.5 feet.
Wow, welcome to
Minnesota. It was pretty crazy. But it's beautiful. I used to live in Northeast Ohio as a child, and I remember some of the snows that we'd get there, and it was very reminiscent of that. So it kind of took me back to my childhood. It was pretty nice, actually. But before we jump into any kind of ID work, any talk about plants, it's really important that we all have an understanding of some of the basic terminology that I'll be using. So many of you may already know these terms, but I'm just going to quickly go through them to make sure that we're all on the same page, essentially. So this schematic in front of you is to help you visualize what a flower might look like if I cut it right down the middle and had you look at it from the side. So the first most obvious thing that you see are, of course, these pink petals. And the primary purpose of those is attracting pollinators. So beneath those are these green petal-like sepals, which protect the flower when it's in bud. The female reproductive structure, which is called the pistil, emerges often from the center of the flower and contains the plant's eggs. And then, of course, we've got these male stamens that surround the pistil and are topped by anthers that hold pollen for dispersal. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about some groups of plants, and then I'll move on to some individual species that I find really cool. But to start, we're going to discuss really one of the most difficult plant families, which is the aster or composite family. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention this because it's enormously important for specialist bees. So the family name Asteraceae can be somewhat misleading because when people think of asters, they tend to think of our New England aster and our heath aster, which kind of have this very stereotypical daisy-like look to them, kind of like what you see on the screen here. However, there are so many plants in this family that don't meet this convention, and as a result, that can make this family a little bit confusing, I guess. So many botanists and botanical enthusiasts will instead refer to this family as the composite family, which kind of refers to the structure of these individual plants. But again, the names composite and aster, I'll be using those interchangeably throughout this talk. I will mention that they have a complicated structure. There's no two ways about it. But if you know what to look for, then it becomes really easy to identify composites in the landscape. So the typical composite family flower has this, again, stereotypical daisy look where you have what looks like a united center in the middle, and then you've got a bunch of petals around that center. However, what looks like a single flower is actually a flower head composed of dozens to hundreds of tiny, tiny little flowers. So the flower cluster can be made up of two different types of flowers. So in the center, you're generally going to have what are called disc flowers. So those are kind of the tubular ones that you see on the screen. And then around that ring, you'll have the petal-like ray flowers. So if we look at this oxeye daisy, for example, each of those white petals is actually a ray flower, and each of the yellow dots in the center is a disc flower. So the dark ones in the center have already received pollen, and those are working on creating seeds. But the rougher ones around the perimeter are what are in full bloom right now. So you can kind of think about each of these plants as being a bouquet of sorts. So these composites can either be radiate, meaning they both have discs and rays on the same flower head, or they can be discoid, kind of like this bone set, or they can be ligulate, just like this dandelion right here. So there are lots and lots and lots of different composites that we can talk about, but I'll just go with a couple that you may already know. So some of those include our coneflowers and our sunflowers. And these kind of fall into the general category of what botanists like to call DYCs, so darn yellow composites, because it can be notoriously difficult to identify. But the great thing is that a lot of these composites are really, really beautiful and flashy, and they do a great job in formal landscapes as well. So for example, our black-eyed Susans, which you can see in the center here, they're very, very often used in landscaping, which is great because that means more foraging opportunity for our specialist pollinators. So the great thing about these plants specifically is that they kind of have, being that they have so many individual flowers on a single head, they kind of offer an assembly line of pollination, so to speak. So it's really, really efficient for the individual pollinators that are using them. We also have a bunch of fall composites, and these do tend to be a little bit less of your stereotypical aster look. So a lot of people do tend to be a little cruel, for example, to goldenrods, because, in some contexts, they can be a little weedy. But the great thing about them is that they are hosts to an incredible diversity of native specialist bees. There's a mining bee, for example, that will only forage upon goldenrods. So if you allow the goldenrods in your space to grow, at least to some extent, you are facilitating the reproduction of those bees. Another really important family from a pollination standpoint, from a specialist bee pollination standpoint, is the parsley carrot family. And so these are defined by what's called a compound umbel flower cluster, which is generally a flat-topped or slightly rounded cluster that's usually at the very end of the stem. So all of the flower stalks will attach at a singular point. So you can imagine the structure by taking an umbrella and turning it upside down, essentially. So the flowers are generally going to be white, greenish, or yellow. And an example that everybody's familiar with, I'm sure, is Queen Anne's lace that you can see pictured here. There are a lot of plants in this family, but the ones that are most valuable from a specialist bee standpoint, generally include anise root and yellow meadow parsnip. There's another really great parsley carrot family plant called Golden Alexanders, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. A great yellow plant, excellent in early spring. I will caution you that there is a lookalike to this plant that you should be aware of, and it's called wild parsnip. And so the difference between this plant and wild parsnip is that you can see that the leaf on the Golden Alexander, it looks somewhat neat, I guess. You've got the individual leaflets on the stem, and they're all fairly separated. But when it comes to the wild parsnip, it looks shaggier. I'm sorry, I don't have a better description for you, but really when it comes to identifying these plants in the field, you kind of just have to learn to know it by sight, because those leaves are really the diagnostic feature there. So just be careful if you're taking a look at a Golden Alexander in the field is all I'm saying. All right, so another big family is the legume family. So the great thing about this family is that you have nothing to worry about here, because a lot of the edible peas, beans that we eat, all of them, in fact, are from the legume family. So generally, you're not going to run into anything that's toxic within this family. And they have a really distinctive flower shape, which I've heard described as kind of a sailboat shape of sorts. So there are two joined petals on the top, and then there are two smaller petals on the side and a fifth petal between those two wings in the center. So one of my personal favorites is the Eastern Redbud, which is kind of a small tree, but I'm sure everybody who lives in Ohio has seen this one and is very familiar with it. And in fact, it's probably just about everybody's favorite early spring tree because of that bright pink color. The flowers are also edible, which is pretty cool. So very, very useful, beautiful plant from a lot of different perspectives. And yeah, you can see that very stereotypical pea family look to the individual flowers. Another really important group from a specialist standpoint is our spring ephemerals. So these include our spring beauties, violets, trout lilies, waterleaf, and then bitter cresses and geraniums. So of course, as everybody knows, these plants tend to bloom for a very, very short period of time. We're talking, 6 weeks or less, sometimes in many cases, even less than that. But many of our early spring bees, so many of our andrenid bees, for example, they're very, very heavily dependent on these plants because, they're emerging around a time when not much else is in bloom except for these spring ephemerals. So if you have a woodland setting, for example, putting in some of these spring ephemerals is a great way to facilitate bee populations in your area. I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of my favorite wetland wildflowers for specialist bees. So these include pickerelweed, which has kind of that heart-shaped leaf and bright purple flower cluster. Our hibiscuses, which if anybody has a rose of Sharon, for example, this looks very, very similar. And then our yellow loosestrifes. Now, the interesting thing about these plants specifically is that they attract a type of bee called an oil collecting bee. So rather than offering pollen and nectar as a reward for the bees that visit them, they offer oil and pollen. So the oils are mixed with the pollen, excuse me, are mixed with the pollen to provision their offspring rather than the nectar, which is really cool. And only a specific type of bee will utilize that oil. All right, so we have a couple of plants that are very, very common and then have kind of an uncommon counterpart, which I thought was really interesting. So we have our native beard tongues, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with. Everybody's seen a foxglove beard tongue, for example. But then there is a false foxglove within the genus Agellinus rather. And those are in high quality habitats. And then we have our genus Minarda. So this is our bee balm. Again, I'm sure everybody's very familiar with bee balm. But the uncommon counterpart to this one is called spotted horsemint, which is only in kind of sandy areas up in northwestern Ohio. So the Oak Openings region, for example. And just a really interesting plant. I haven't seen a whole lot like it, but definitely has a lot of those characteristic mint family features. And then there are a couple of really odd plants that I really like personally. So we have our yellow passion flower, which is generally going to be native to southern Ohio, but it's very closely related to the purple passion flower that many of you may have seen. And it's got that very, very strange reproductive structure. It's got like a stage upon which the pistil and the stamens sit. And then it's got that fringe around the edge. So it's really kooky. We also have our daughters, which are actually a vine as well, but they are a parasitic vine. So the green that you see in the background is actually a different plant that the daughter is parasitizing off of. So what is actually the plant is that yellow, sallow, orange piece of spaghetti that's wrapping around that stalk. And then the white flowers on there are the flowers of the daughter. So a really interesting plant, but with a lot of cool specialists that forage off of that. And then lastly, our prickly pear cactus, which is our only native cactus in this area, generally found in sandy soils, but it's got that bright yellow flower to it. So really cool. I think that's really all I have in terms of the individual plants, but I wanted to make sure that I had a chance to talk a little bit about this guide, because I think, oops, let's see, I think I might have closed it out, so I might need to stop sharing for just a moment while I figure out where I put it. Give me just one moment. Sorry, folks, this may take a second.
So Livia, I know when you were at Dawes, you had James Hung was a friend and colleague who was I think working on his PhD at that time, right, with Karen Goodell, right, one of our biology researchers at OSU Newark, and he would come to Dawes and look at different plants, and he takes amazing pictures of bees. And found actually quite a few specialists and uploaded those images to iNaturalist. And so he really taught me a lot about specialists in that, if you don't have the plants, you're not going to have the specialist bee. Just because you have the plants doesn't mean the bees are going to be able to find them, right? Especially if it's a small bee, they may not be able to, find their way to your locality. But if you don't have the plant, you'll never have the bee. And so anyway, just really love James's photographs.
Yeah, and I love what you're saying there, because it's absolutely true. I mean, one of the plants that I pointed out to you folks, the yellow loosestrife, at the Dawes Arboretum, my former employer, we used to have, they currently still have just these enormous expanses of that plant, and they're spontaneous, meaning that they weren't planted in the wetland where they're found. But even though, you know, we've had populations of that plant there for several years, we're still not finding the oil collecting bee that is known to forage on them. So it just goes to show that there are so many dynamics and so many factors at play when it comes to recruiting specialist bees to your habitats. So I will say, you know, if you put in a plant and you don't immediately have that specialist, you know, if you go through the effort of actually identifying the specialists that do visit, you know, don't be disappointed. There's so much about bee ecology and bee biology and bee dynamics that is still left to be learned. So it's possible that, you know, there are other factors that are influencing that. And so let's take a look now at this guide to specialist bees. And of course, I want to start off by giving credit where credit is due. This guide would not have been possible without the work done by Sam Droege and Jared Fowler, who did a lot of the fundamental work on putting together lists of specialist bees within various ecoregions, as well as creating the handy bee manual off of which this guide was based. And so this guide is meant to be user-friendly to folks at really all levels of experience with botanical identification. And the great thing is that it's organized in a really, really fantastic way, that at least that I think, because rather than being organized by Latin name or by name of the plant, it's organized in such a way that you can look for bees by season. So I'm going to show you a quick example of that. Hopefully you can see this all right. But let's say you are out in early spring, you're out in May, and you're looking for plants that might have specialist bees in your area. You know, you can immediately look at this page and identify the species that you might be likely to encounter in your own area at that exact time of year. And then you can follow that down to the individual page to learn more about those plants. So for example, let's say we want to learn about spring beauties, where we can see that they're going to be up between March and May, and we can go to page 14, luckily the very next page, to learn a little bit more about them. And so you can get detailed information on each of these pages about how to identify these plants in the field. You can learn about where they're going to be grown, approximate bloom time, and then you can also see photos of the specialist bees that are going to be foraging on them. So I like spring beauty specifically because its specialist bee will often have bright pink pollen on its legs, which is a pretty diagnostic feature of the spring beauty specialist, because of course spring beauties have pink pollen. And so this guide was put together by myself, Melissa Spring, and also Amy Schnebelin, who's an amazing graphic designer and bee enthusiast in the Northern Ohio area. And yeah, I guess I'll just kind of peruse through the document. And if anybody has any questions about this specifically, I would love to field them. But you can see that, you know, the graphics are top notch. We did our best to ensure that different forms of the same plants were available, so that, you know, let's say you're out looking for trout lilies, you can see that there's both a white and a yellow form, so you know to look for those differences in the field. And then of course, there are also these excellent photos of the specialist bees as well. So I'm really hopeful that this guide will help folks in learning a little bit more about specialist bees and learning about what is really needed to make sure that these specialists are able to remain in our landscapes. So that really concludes everything that I wanted to talk about with you folks today. So I would welcome any questions or any comments or yeah, anything like that.
Great, thanks so much, Livia. So there were a couple comments as you were sharing the information, and I love your good, strong botanical knowledge. You did a nice training for the specialist cooperators who are going out in the field, and it's just, yeah, you have such a nice way to present what you know about botany that I appreciate.
Thank
So folks were asking where they could get a copy of the guide. So I put the link in there, the direct link, and it's also on our course site under our Specialist Bee Week. So you can get that there. Someone asked about Epimedium, and do you know, is there an Epimedium species that's native to Ohio? I know it as a non-native garden plant, but I was thinking.
I know of no native Epimedium species, but I would be happy to look into that and get back to you.
Okay, awesome. Before you came on, we were having some nice discussion about how to find out. Maybe you have some thoughts from your background. How do you find out what plants were growing, a century, 2 centuries ago in your regionality? We were talking about, finding natural areas and seeing what's growing there. But what kind of documents or resources do you use as a conservationist, as a botanist, to help create that picture of what was growing in a site?
Sure. So yeah, when it comes to a century ago, 2 centuries ago, there is limited information, and usually the information that is available is in the form of, cover maps, essentially. But those are very, very general. I'll tell you about the eastern deciduous forest, the beech maple forests in our area. And so when it comes down to that level of specificity, looking for the individual species that were present, I don't know of too many good resources, but within the field of restoration, which is the field that I know most about, it's usually the strategy to look at what's called a reference ecosystem. So if you have in your local region an ecosystem that has similar conditions to the area that you're looking to plant within, so let's say, for example, you're looking to enhance a small wetland in your backyard, maybe going to a wetland that has been maintained properly or that's been restored recently within your own area, and looking at the types of plant communities that are present within that high quality ecosystem and looking to replicate that within your own area is a great way to enhance areas using a native assemblage of local plants.
Okay, great, thank you. There was a question about your office in Maine. Is it and what you're doing, what you'll be doing with Circe's there?
Sure. So yes, I'll be working out of the Bangor NRCS office, which is the state natural resource office. And my work with Xerces is going to be really interesting. I'll be working with folks at a variety of levels, so primarily agricultural producers, but also state entities and nonprofit organizations to convert their landscapes into pollinator-friendly landscapes. So in the context of farms, for example, looking at implementing IPM practices rather than blanket spraying, looking at installing hedgerows for native pollinators and also native prairie plantings. So it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, well, they're really lucky to have you up there. That's for sure. I was going to mention you talked about the specialist bee on, just flew out of my mind, the spring ephemeral with the light pink pollen.
Yes, Spring Beauty.
On Spring Beauty. Do you know the study that Jennifer Eisen's lab did about whether that bee is a good pollinator or not?
Oh, I haven't read it, no, but I'd love to see it.
Yeah, so this is a great story. So we often think that if a bee is a specialist on a plant, it must be the best pollinator, right? But actually, studies have shown that just because a bee specializes on that pollen doesn't mean it's a very good pollinator or even the best pollinator. And so I believe, I'll try to find the reference for that. I believe it was one of Jennifer Eisen, who's at the College of Worcester. I think it was one of her students who studied that plant, and they studied all the pollinators that visited when the flowers were open, and found that actually the specialist was taking more pollen and not distributing it to enough of the flowers. And so it was actually, confusing the whole picture of pollination, that other pollinators were better serving the flower than the specialist. So just, there are always so many complexities about pollinators. As I train people, sometimes they think if a insect is close to a flower, it's a pollinator, or if it lands on the flower, it's a pollinator. If it eats from the flower, it's a pollinator. It's not always the case, right? There are all these different layers of complexity. And in that case, the specialist was not a very good pollinator.
Yeah. And that really just goes to show that, while there are so many questions that can be answered by science, there's still so much work to be done. And so any opportunity that we have to study these bees is, it's so incredibly important, because that they really do form such an important part of our ecosystem. So I'm very curious to read that study. So you'll have to pass it along.
Good. Yeah, I definitely will. I will. Let's see. Did I miss any other questions? Anybody from the chat box? There were questions about whether there's a hard copy of the Specialist Bee Guide for Ohio, and I don't think there were any printed.
No. The goal was to make it as available to everyone as possible, and it's never been our goal to make money off of this, of course. So anyone can go and print it off and get it bound at a Staples if that's what they would like. But we wanted to make sure that it was freely available to anybody who might want to see it.
Great. Okay. Well, Livia, thank you so much for joining us. And I know this is a really super busy time with you just getting your legs under you up there in Maine, but I appreciate your coming in and sharing one of your passions, specialist bees and the plants they love.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.
Take care.